Hello, everyone. I'm Zara,
And I'm Hugo.
and today we're gonna talk about data
Data
binding.
binding, yes.
Yay! So, what is data binding, Hugo?
Data binding, in the formal definition, it's a library that allows you to bind UI components to your layouts and data sources in your app using declarative format rather than programmatically. But that doesn't say anything to me, right?
That's a lot of
Uh,
words.
yeah, it's a lot of words.
Mm.
TLDR, it allows you to move some stuff that you usually would write in code as a declaration into your layout files by adding binding expressions.
Okay, so how do I enable it in my project?
So it's a simple addition to your Gradle file. All you need to do is set the data binding enable to true and apply the Kotlin capt plugin if you're using Kotlin. Of course, you are using Kotlin. And in Android, in an HTTP 4, so Android Studio 4 and up, it's slightly different. Then you specify the build features. And after that, you're already good to go.
Yeah, one important thing to remember if you have multi modules in your application is that you have to enable data binding in all of your modules, like what Hugo mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so that means if you have like a feature module that uses some data binding stuff, then the module using that module also needs to enable data binding, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about why we like data binding, I guess, and how we use it. Some simple example where I think the declarative part really shines is where you can reduce some boilerplate. Normally, for example, if you have this image view, you want to give it some rounded corners, you would have to write a line of code to set the clip to outline on the view because there's no view attribute to do that. But with data binding, we can actually specify it in the place where, in my opinion, it belongs in the view. You can now say app clip to outline and give it a data binding expression. In this case, is a constant expression of true, and that will effectively call the setter on this image view and set clip to outline and set it to true. And the end result is that you have this nice fancy rounded corners that we all like in our apps. Yeah, this is like a simple example where you just save some lines of code and move some other stuff that you otherwise would write in code to the view. Yeah, so one other place where you can use data binding to good effect, I think, is if you have your view and it needs to be reactive, it needs to update as your data updates. Now you can use live data for that. And it's kind of magical. All you need to do is set a lifecycle owner. You reference your live data in your view, and then your view will basically update automatically as that live data that you reference updates. And I have a short example of this. We have an example project to GitHub showing all of this. But here's how you set it up. You have your activity with your binding. And then you provided the view model. And you provided the lifecycle owner. And for activities, that will just be this. And then your view model would expose this live data. In our example, it's a profile. And then in your view itself, you actually have that as a variable, and then you reference that variable in a text view, for example. So we have a view model.profile.name, and so every time the profile changes, the name that is displayed on the screen will then also update. And I think that's pretty elegant. It doesn't you don't need to write all that code that you otherwise would need to write by hand to make this view update.
So they can play with this example in our GitHub project that we're going to put the link to in the comments or in the video description.
Exactly. And that has a lot more stuff than we are showing on the slide. So
Yeah.
yeah.
One of my most favorite features of data binding is that it greatly simplifies writing custom views. So say we have some reusable components like some repeating UI elements that are stylable. So in this example, we have a banner that appears in several pages in our app. And each banner would have its own attributes like a highlight color, a background color, and some text that goes with it. The layout for this banner is pretty straightforward. It's just a text view and a view for our highlight. But if we use data binding, we can simply pass in the type of banner that we need to display, and data binding will take care of setting the correct value for each of the components in our custom view. So a little bit later in our talk, we will show you how to do that. But for now, let's just accept the fact that data binding can do this for us.
Yeah.
So, so now if we need to use this custom view or this banner in another part of our app, we can just simply include the layout and then give it the banner type, and then we're done.
Yeah, it saves so much code.
Yeah. So, Hugo, we've both been using data binding for quite a few years now, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, why don't we talk about some of the things that we have used in real life, in our real projects with data binding?
Yeah.
All right. Let's do it. One of the data mining features that I noticed we tend to use a lot in some of my projects are string formatting. So we usually have some strings with some placeholder text in it, or some plurals. So anything that's basically string formatting, data binding can simplify it for us. So let's take the hello string, for example. So we have a string with two placeholder texts inside it. And with data binding, we can instantly use this string and then populate the placeholders with the actual values. Like going back to our example before of the profile, we can simply give it the name and the location, and data binding will format the string for us.
Yeah, so much nicer than writing this out in code with getString and all these placeholders.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
This really makes sense.
So data binding has a lot more expressions that it supports, and we've put up this link here, and everyone can go check out what those expressions are.
There are a lot, though.
There are a lot, that is true. Another thing that we tend to use a lot is custom listeners. So let's take, for example, an edit text, right? So usually the most common thing I find is that we need to listen to edit text changes. So as the user types in, we want to react or do something in our app. And the annoying thing is we only care about on text changed in this example, but we still have to implement all the individual callbacks, even if we don't care about them. So in our app, we usually say like do nothing, which basically means ignore it. But with data binding, there is an existing framework binding adapter that we get for free. It's already implemented in the library. So instead of implementing all those all the callbacks in that interface, we can simply call the callback that we actually care about. In this case, it's on text changed, and then react accordingly. Makes it much simpler, no noise in the code, pretty straightforward. So one thing I noticed though is that not a lot of there are some binding adapters that do not exist in the framework. So one of those being for the OG view pager. Similar to edit text, usually we only care about one callback for view pagers. And if we follow the pattern of how the edit text binding adapter is implemented in the framework, we can implement something similar for our view pagers. So all this code is in our sample project in GitHub, and everyone can just look at it and read it in your own time and at your own pace. So once we implement that binding adapter, then we can pick and choose which callbacks we care about and then implement those methods. Makes it really simple.
That's cool.
So the framework binding adapters are a bit hard to find. So we've conveniently put in a link for you so you can check out what existing binding adapters are so you don't have to re-implement them yourself. But Hugo,
Yes.
what about those times where you need to set something in a view dynamically? Say like the layout height, for example, of a view.
Yeah. Most of the time this works, but in this case it doesn't, right?
Yeah, so sometimes if your value needs to come from the API, for example, if you have a view that's dynamically setting the height, just setting it directly in data binding will not work. And this is because each view, when it's inflated, needs the width and the height to be set explicitly. But then if we use data binding, the library kind of strips out all the data binding expressions. So at compile time, there's no value set for the height, and it doesn't work. So to solve this issue, data binding has a mechanism by which we can provide a default value. This default value will then be used at inflation time, and then our layout now works.
That's great. I was about to say there should be something like a default value, but there actually is.
Yes, surprise!
Great.
So, what about recycler views? I would bet you have a bunch of recycler views in your app.
Yeah, I would say that most of the apps are built nowadays are essentially list-based. They're all lists of things, right? They're lists with different sections and different kind of items. And data binding actually works great with frameworks that support that, like Epoxy and Groupy. I personally use Groupy a lot. And what I like about that is that Groupy has this concept of groups and items. And items is basically a group of one. And if you use that in combination with data binding, then you have your item, you pass it in some kind of thing that you want to display. So in this case, it could be a profile again. And then you have this bindable item that takes a binding. And you only need to specify what layout this binding is for. And then in the bind function, you basically set the thing that you want to bind on your data binding class. And that's all there is to it. Then again, the view will just update based on that model that you have set. And this could be like a simple data class, could be a whole view model, could be anything. But I think it's pretty elegant to integrate data binding with Groupy this way.
It's really cool. We also have Groupy in our app, and Epoxy as well. And both frameworks, why not? And both frameworks support data binding out of the box. What about resources? I bet you use some resources in your apps.
I definitely do. And what I like about it is that you can reference like drawables and all kinds of dimensions and that kind of stuff. You can mention those in the data binding expressions.
Yep.
But sometimes you run it into a little bit of a problem there, because resource types are integers, colors are integers, and that sometimes gives a little bit of an issue.
Yeah, so let's take our banner example from earlier. So it provides us two color resources, the highlight and the background. And if we put it in data binding and we run our app, it's not giving me the color that I'm expecting. Oh my God, it should be blue. So what happened here? So yeah, it's precisely what you mentioned. Color resources are integers, and the Android view kind of requires the color to be resolved before we set it as the background color. So to do this with data mining, we have several options. The first of which is you can resolve the color in our XML directly. Bonus points here is that the context is automatically imported for us and we can use it directly in our XML. The other option would be to create a binding adapter for resolving our color. So it's basically moving the code that we put in our XML into a binding adapter in our Kotlin file, and then we set the background color programmatically.
Yeah, I would generally prefer that, but that's more like a personal taste, I guess.
Yeah. So depends on what works for your team or what your team prefers, but either option works. And now, if we want to use this binding adapter in our XML file, we reference the adapter name that we set, which is banner highlight in this case, and then give it the banner type. But what if we don't want to create a new attribute? What if we don't want something that's called banner highlight? What do we do then?
I don't know. What do we do then?
What do we do then? We can override the Android background attribute, and then we simply rename our binding adapter to use Android background, and that's it.
Cool.
So this is pretty. We tend to do this sometimes when something we don't want to create custom attributes for, say, content description, like accessibility, implementation, stuff like that. It's kind of useful, but then it's same as before. It's up to your team's preference to figure out if you want to create custom attributes or if you want to reuse existing Android attributes.
Yeah, because the problem is it might be a little bit confusing, right? If you override Android visibility, for example, you set it to true.
Yeah.
While usually you expect it's invisible, gone, or visible.
Yeah.
That might be confusing when you see that XML, right? So
yeah.
I tend to have like something like a show or hide kind of attribute.
Yeah.
But again, it's more like a discussion that you should have with your team, I guess, to have consensus of what's acceptable use of data binding for you.
Yeah. Because I think as we've seen in the previous slides, data binding is pretty powerful. It allows you to basically do anything you want. But one important thing to remember is that just because it allows you to do it doesn't mean that you should.
Exactly.
So, Hugo, what kind of support does Android Studio have for data binding?
Yeah, historically it wasn't that great, but over the past years, I'd say starting with Android Studio 3, maybe 3.5 especially, there was a lot of good stuff added. So yeah, maybe you can show a bit of that.
So let's say you have an existing layout that you want to convert to data binding. There's a really handy shortcut to do it so that you don't have to remember the data binding syntax all the time. So you can just press Alt-Enter on the root tag of your layout and then choose Convert to Data Binding, and ta-da! Our layout is now data binding enabled. Clap, clap, clap. Trivia, I requested for this feature 2 years ago. I kind of made people star that issue so we can get it.
Yeah, it's very useful. I'm glad we have it now. What used to happen when you added a view into a layout, you needed to recompile your project because the binding would need to be updated. But in recent versions of Android Studio, I say at least 3.5 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Now the IDE just will update that for you immediately. So now if you reference that new view that you added to the binding, to the layout, you can immediately use that in your IDE, which is pretty great.
That's so great.
Saves a lot of time.
Especially if you have a bigger app where it takes quite a while to compile. Now you don't even have to wait for it to compile anymore.
Right. Another thing that they added recently is that you can now, in your layouts, click on any variable or even a property of a view model, for example, and it will just go to the right place in your IDE. So if you click on some kind of property, it will open the file of your view model showing you that property. If you click on an attribute which has a data binding adapter, it will jump to that data binding adapter. So that makes working with the whole data binding setup way more enjoyable, because otherwise you would have to look up your data binding adapter by hand, or you have to open that file manually. So yeah, that's a nice addition.
Do you remember when you have to Command F to find your binding adapters?
Yeah, it's annoying.
Yeah, those were dark, dark days.
Yeah, shout out to David for that.
So I guess with my experience with data mining all these years, I can definitely say that our quality of life with using data mining the past year has improved dramatically, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah,
So
I would definitely agree.
yeah, so I would recommend that, if you've tried data mining 3 years ago and it annoyed you a bit because things don't work, error messages are hard to read, like, a lot of those has really improved over the past year. So I would definitely recommend that you give it another go.
Yep.
And probably the most important pro tip, Hugo, is that
Yeah.
people should file bugs.
Yeah, that's important. It's important across the board for Android tools, of course, but especially for data binding, because yeah, if you want to get better, you have to tell the folks what's not working for you. And yeah, like you mentioned, your IDE suggestion to have a layout converted, that was only brought to the attention because you filed a bug. So yay for that.
Yeah, for sure. So, like, don't just complain online, file bugs, and then we'll all help each other to get those bugs fixed.
Exactly.
So, we've collated some of the links that we've mentioned earlier, and there are some resources available online. A lot of people have written about data binding over the past years. I did some talks on data binding, and
Yeah.
Hugo did some too. So we're going to put up links to all those resources for you. And we hope that you have a happy time binding.
Binding your data.
Bind your data. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye bye.
You should wave. You should wave. You should wave. You should wave.